If you're here right now, thank you. Maybe you're lying down, trying to escape the hum of the world, looking for something slow, something human, something that doesn't ask too much of you. So here it is, a story not about kings or battles, but about something quieter, about surviving the winter, one long breath at a time. There was a house once, long, dark, heavy with the scent of smoke, wool, and old sweat. Not a palace, not even a cottage with lace curtains and polished floors. Just a longhouse. A long wooden spine laid flat against the snow, groaning in the wind. Its bones were timber, thick and rough, shaped by axes and years. The roof sagged like a tired back, covered in thatch that leaked when it rained but held warmth like a secret when the cold came hard. Inside, everything lived. Chickens, dogs, 2 cows, and a goat. A family of 7. Grandmother with her bent fingers and faded eyes. A boy who coughed all winter but never stopped carving figures from driftwood. A woman who used to sing before frost took her voice. All of them, huddled in one space. The floor was earth, packed and frozen, strewn with straw to catch the worst of the cold. Along the walls, beds made from planks and skins, layers upon layers of anything soft. Children slept in the corners, curled like kittens. Adults lay in pairs, or threes, under the same woolen blankets, not for affection, but for heat. There was always fire. In the center of the house, the hearth smoldered day and night. Its smoke had nowhere to go, so it hung in the air like a ghost, swirling under the beams, soaking into clothes, lungs, memory. The fire warmed the bones, yes, but it also burned the eyes, cracked the lips, filled the chest with a slow, grinding cough that never quite left. But without it, they wouldn't have made it past November. Maybe you've never thought of a cow as central heating. But here, Freya, the cow with one ear missing and a soft, wet nose, was sacred. She chewed calmly beside the fire, her bulk a silent wall of warmth. When the wind howled outside and the door rattled like an old man's teeth, Freya stood firm. She didn't ask for much. A little hay, a little space, and someone to scratch behind her horns. Children played around her hooves. They built forts from firewood, made up stories about the trolls in the rafters, and dared each other to touch the goat's tail. Laughter rose like steam, brief, bright, and gone. The adults didn't laugh as often, but they watched. Eyes soft, tired, grateful. Dinner was boiled roots, salted fish, and hard bread. No one complained. Complaints wasted breath, and breath meant warmth. They chewed slowly, methodically, seated in a circle around the fire, bowls balanced on knees, steam rising into the smoke already thick in the air. Grandmother whispered old songs no one remembered fully. Just fragments. A word, a hum, a pause. The longhouse didn't sleep so much as settle. Sounds never stopped. Snoring, shifting, the creak of wood, the low moo of a dreaming cow. But there was peace in that chaos, a rhythm, like the slow inhale and exhale of something larger than any one person. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't clean. But it was enough. If you're still here, maybe it means something to you too. Maybe you've known a place that smelled like survival. A room where silence was heavy, but not empty. A place where everyone's breath mattered. And if you ever find yourself cold, truly cold, not the kind you fix with a jacket, but the kind that seeps into your thoughts, I hope you remember this longhouse, where fire and fur and breath held back the dark. And if this story sat with you tonight, even just a little, consider leaving a like or a comment, not because you have to, just so we know you're out there, still breathing, still warm, still here. Maybe you didn't notice it at first. The fire, I mean. You smelled it, of course. Its smoke had already curled into your clothes by the time you stepped into the longhouse. But to notice the fire, to truly see it, that took time. Because it wasn't just flames, it was memory, a heartbeat, a stubborn little sun refusing to die. In the center of the longhouse, the hearth never went out. Even when the wind outside screamed like a hungry thing, even when all the wood was damp and the world seemed ready to crack in half from cold, there was still fire, or at least a whisper of it. Coals tucked deep beneath ash, still glowing, still waiting. Every night before sleep, someone would bend low over the embers, usually the grandmother, with her shaking hands and quiet rituals, and lift a clay jar. Inside, buried in layers of ash, were glowing stones of warmth, tiny suns smoldering in silence. She would place one gently back into the hearth's center, feed it with a piece of dried moss, then coax it to life with a hollow breath, slow and sure, and the fire would wake, not with fury, but with grace. It flickered, then danced. Shadows stretched. Faces changed shape in its glow. Wrinkles softened, scars deepened. You could measure a man's worry by how close he sat to the flame. You could tell who had lost someone recently by the way they stared not at the fire, but through it. Children knew the cue. The first snap of a log, sharp, clean, like a promise, meant it was time. Time for the stories. Maybe you're the kind of person who loves stories, especially in the dark, when the edges of the world feel less solid. If so, you would have fit right in. They didn't have books. They had memory, and voices, and the fire. The storyteller was never chosen. It just happened. One person would start humming, an old forgotten melody, half prayer, half lullaby, and soon a voice would follow. Not always the same voice. Sometimes the boy with the driftwood toys would begin, voice thin and cracking. Sometimes it was the mother who didn't sing anymore, who found her voice only when the shadows were long and her hands were still. And sometimes it was no one at all, just the fire speaking through the crackle and hiss, telling stories older than language. They told of gods who hid their faces in trees, of trolls with moss in their ears, of foxes who could steal fire from the stars. Some tales were short and sharp, like a sudden frost. Others wound on for hours, full of heartbreak and blood and laughter so big it shook the dust from the beams above. No one interrupted, not even the goats. The fire had rules. You don't lie beside it without offering a memory. You don't take its warmth without sharing a truth. And you don't mock a story, even the silly ones, because once someone died to keep that story alive. The smoke rose thick around them, always. It stung the eyes, filled the lungs, turned every breath into a negotiation. There were no chimneys in the old longhouses. The smoke went where it pleased, up, sideways, down again. It left no corner untouched. Some nights it clung so heavy that the youngest would cough themselves to sleep. But no one ever opened the door to let it out. The cold would have killed faster than any smoke, so they breathed it in, day after day, season after season. Their bodies learned to tolerate it. Their eyes adjusted to the haze. They learned how to speak without gasping, how to sing in a hoarse whisper. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the smoke curled just right, it formed shapes. Faces, maybe. A dog long gone. A father who never came back from the sea. A promise you forgot you made. The fire held those things. It was cruel sometimes. Flames didn't care who you were, only what you fed them. It would burn your best blanket as quickly as it would burn a rotten board. But in its cruelty, there was honesty. You always knew where you stood with the fire. People told stories around it. But the fire? It remembered them. Every joke, every sorrow, every secret confessed in a moment too tired to guard the heart. Gone into smoke, maybe. but never truly lost. There were nights when silence ruled, when grief came too heavy and no one had the strength to speak. On those nights, the fire still talked, in the way it flickered, shifted, sighed. It mourned with them, or at least it made the room feel less empty. The children, of course, didn't think this way. To them, fire was just magic, a warm place to toast a scrap of bread, a dancing thing that glowed when you poked it with a stick. They played near it without fear, with the confidence of those who've never lived through real loss, but even they, in their small wisdom, knew that the fire meant safety, that as long as it burned, the Longhouse lived. Sometimes the oldest child would wake in the night, drawn by a dream or a cough or nothing at all. And he'd sit by the embers, watching them breathe, watching the ghosts in the smoke. He'd listen, not with ears, but with something deeper. And in those moments, as the rest of the house slept in piles of limbs and dreams, he'd whisper a wish into the coals, not a grand wish, not riches or revenge or the gods' favor, just a simple one. Let it still be burning tomorrow. Because in the North, survival wasn't loud, it was quiet, repetitive. The same fire relit, the same story retold, the same breath again and again until winter loosened its grip. And you, sitting wherever you are, listening now, you know what that's like, don't you? To hold on through repetition, to survive not with grand gestures, but with small, stubborn rituals, a warm drink, a deep breath, a story at night. If this fire has warmed you, even just a little, let me know. Leave a trace, a whisper in the form of a comment, a silent nod in the shape of a like. Not because I asked, but because some stories are worth tending. Even now, especially now. Let the fire keep burning. By now, you might understand. Survival in the North wasn't dramatic. It was fabric. It was threads. It was the weight of a single blanket pulled up over a shoulder while the wind outside tried to peel the walls apart. And that blanket? It was always made of wool, not the soft kind you might find in stores now, not dyed in pastels or machine-stitched into perfect lines. No, this wool was scratchy, stubborn, real. It had the smell of sheep, of smoke, of someone's hands. You see, in the Longhouse, wool wasn't just material. It was sacred. It was spun from time. The women, and sometimes the men too, when their hands weren't blistered from axe handles or salted fish, would sit for hours, turning raw fleece into life-saving warmth. The sound of the spindle was like a heartbeat, constant and grounding, a soft whir, a gentle click, over and over, twist, pull, breathe, twist, pull, breathe. Children learned early. By the age of 6, their small fingers were expected to hold their own spindle, to take part in the rhythm of survival. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but honestly. Each crooked thread was a lesson in patience, each tangled knot a chance to try again, and when they got it right, oh, the pride. A single strand, spun straight, was cause for celebration. It meant one more stitch in someone's socks, one more layer for the baby who slept closest to the door, one more chance at staying alive. Every person had something made by someone they loved, a scarf from a mother now gone, mittens passed down 3 generations, a tunic so patched and threadbare it was more memory than fabric, but still, it was worn, because to wear it was to remember, and to remember was to endure. They didn't dress for beauty, they dressed for battle, against the cold, against the wind that sliced through gaps in the wall, against the nights when even the fire whispered, I might not be enough. So they layered, tunic over tunic, wool over wool, rough against soft, a shirt that had belonged to a cousin, under a vest made by a grandmother, under a cloak woven by the hands of someone no longer there. Each layer held a story, Each story held heat. Sometimes, in the early morning light, if you could call it that, a pale gray that slipped through the slats in the roof, you could see them dressing, slowly, deliberately, like priests before a ceremony, pulling sleeves over arms, wrapping belts around waists, tucking scarves into collars. And when they stepped outside, they looked larger than life, not because they were proud, but because they wore everything they had. Even the socks were wool, thick, mismatched, often damp. But they mattered. Cold feet could mean lost toes. Lost toes could mean infection. And out here, infection meant a grave dug into frozen ground. So when someone gave you socks, you said thank you like they'd handed you fire. I wonder, have you ever owned something handmade? Something woven for you, not bought? If you have, you know, it carries weight, not just in grams or texture, but in meaning, in hours, in someone's sore back and squinting eyes and silent prayer stitched into each seam. In the Longhouse, they didn't say, "I love you" easily, but they'd knit you a hat. They'd darn your sleeve. They'd leave a pair of mittens by your bed when your fingers started turning blue. And that was enough. There was one girl, I never knew her name, who made a shawl from leftover threads. Every scrap she could find. Green from her brother's tunic, brown from a blanket that no longer kept out the wind, red from the hem of her mother's old skirt. It didn't match. It didn't lie flat. But it was hers. She gave it to her grandmother. The old woman wore it every night, even when her legs stopped working, even when her memory began to blur. And when she passed, they didn't bury the shawl with her. They kept it, hung it by the fire, let the smoke claim it, stitch by stitch, into the air they all breathed. Because wool, like stories, doesn't just vanish, it lingers. If you've ever wrapped yourself in something that made you feel safe, you know what I mean. It's not about the thread. It's about the hands that made it, the warmth that came before you, the quiet promise that someone, somewhere, once believed you were worth protecting from the cold. And if tonight your world feels a little cold, outside or in, remember this. You don't need grandeur. You need layers of kindness, of memory, of stories told beside firelight and wrapped in wool. If you're still here, maybe let me know. A simple sign, a quiet comment. Not because I asked, but because you feel it too. The warmth of something handmade, the weight of something real. Still here, still wrapped, still warm. When the fire began to dim and the last ember settled into its slow glow, the Longhouse shifted once more. Not in sound, but in shape. It became one body, one creature of breath, warmth, and shared skin. Sleep in the Viking winter was not a private act. It was not a moment stolen in silence or behind doors. It was a strategy, an instinct, a collective agreement. We do not survive alone. There were no beds, no separate rooms, no corners claimed as personal sanctuaries. Instead, there were fur pelts laid across the dirt floor, some old and thinning, others still rough from a recent kill. Above them, bodies, layered, overlapping, pressed close like pages in an unreadable book. They did not sleep in rows. They slept in bundles, arms tangled, backs curved together, legs nested like branches in a storm. Children curled between adults. Grandmothers lay with their grandchildren's feet tucked beneath their knees, and brothers pressed shoulder to shoulder without hesitation or shame. They didn't use words like closeness. It simply was. Human warmth was the most valuable form of fire when the wind began to shriek against the walls. The fire in the hearth could burn down to ash. The wind could rattle the thatch above their heads, but as long as bodies remained linked, skin against wool, breath against breath, life remained. Dogs, too, had their place in the ritual. They slept at the feet of the humans, curled into dense knots of fur and breath. The heat they gave off was worth more than loyalty or companionship. They were alive, and in the Longhouse, anything alive was a source of heat. Even infants, too small to generate their own warmth, were kept tight against chests, wrapped in cloth, nestled beneath layers of shared garments. And sometimes, a baby's faint whimper in the night would be soothed not by a mother's song, but by the shift of 4 or 5 bodies, leaning in, drawing closer, as if the entire house was one great living heart, pulling the child inward to beat with it. Space was precious, but not in the way the outside world thought of it. The most coveted space was not privacy, it was proximity, to the center, to the fire, to the warmest cluster of sleep. Yet not everyone got to stay in the middle. Children, small, fidgeting, were often pushed out to the edges in the chaos of shifting bodies. In the morning, it wasn't uncommon to see a little one half awake, shivering at the far corner, their cheeks red with cold. That's why mothers tied yarn to their children's wrists, loops of wool spun tight and knotted to their own sleeves, so that, in the deep of night, they could pull them back, unseen, unspoken, like reeling in a dream. These connections were not sentimental. They were practical. They were ancient. They were necessary. And when someone moved in their sleep, the ripple traveled. A cough from the eldest near the wall, a turn of the shoulder from the boy closest to the door. The Longhouse responded like a creature, adjusting, breathing in waves, redistributing heat with every unconscious movement. Some snored, others whimpered, but the loudest sound, always, was breathing, layered breathing, dozens of lungs finding the same rhythm, the same lull. It was a music older than language, and they slept within it like sailors on the tide. Occasionally, a death came during the coldest nights, quiet, invisible, like sleep that forgot to let go. But even then, the body was not alone. It remained among the living until morning, wrapped, held, pressed into the shared heat until someone noticed the stillness, until someone gently moved away, until the Longhouse, without needing to speak, made space for loss. The warmth lingered a little longer in the place they had left behind, and even grief had its ritual. A belt removed, a fur folded and laid flat. The dead were carried out gently, not mourned in noise, but in the silent shifting of bodies who that night would sleep just a little closer together. Each morning they woke as a tangle, limbs overlapping, hair stuck to skin, faces turned toward each other without embarrassment. They rose not as individuals, but as a cluster peeled apart slowly, with yawns and stiff joints, and eyes that blinked toward the slanting gray light of a new day. No one questioned the smell of each other's breath. No one asked for space. The cold made all such questions irrelevant, because in the Longhouse, survival was not about endurance. It was about contact, and contact, once accepted without pride or shame, became comfort. They didn't name this. They didn't explain it. They just lay down together every night as their ancestors had, and shared heat as if it were breath. The wind could howl all it wanted. Inside, the house breathed back. When the Longhouse stirred awake, breath still thick in the air, the cold remained the same. But the hunger deepened. Warmth could be borrowed from bodies, but calories had to be hunted, stored, rationed, and swallowed, no matter how they tasted. The Viking winter did not care for delicate tongues. It did not reward those who gagged at the first whiff of rot or turned away from flesh that trembled on the edge of edibility. In the North, you ate what didn't kill you. That was the only rule, and it wasn't negotiable. In the darker corners of the Longhouse, where the light from the fire barely reached, stood the barrels, heavy, swollen, bandaged with iron hoops and frozen with a crust of brine along their lids. These were not symbols of abundance. They were survival coffins. They contained what little summer had allowed them to preserve: dried meat, salted fish, smoked offal, lard thickened with ash, fermented root pastes. Everything smelled. Nothing smelled good. A barrel of fermented herring, opened in midwinter, could silence a room. The stench clung to walls, wove through straw bedding, and nested in wool garments for days. But they ate it, not with enthusiasm, but with the resigned efficiency of people who had long stopped confusing food with pleasure. Sometimes a child would cry the first time the barrel lid was lifted, not out of fear, out of instinct, because the scent triggered something primal, a signal that something had died long ago and hadn't left peacefully. But the adults didn't flinch. They cut, they portioned, they chewed, and they taught the children, patiently. This is what survival smells like. They knew which roots to bury in sour whey to keep them edible, which blood to congeal with oats to make a kind of loaf, which animal stomachs could double as storage sacks, and how to layer fish skins to trap the warmth of a meal like bark trapping sap. Fat was sacred, not for taste, but for fuel. A spoonful of rendered animal fat could keep a man upright through a storm. It slid down the throat like warm stone and sat in the belly like fire. And sometimes there were festivals, not joyous ones. No feasts stretched long into the night with music and drink. These were practical gatherings, the kind where the village opened the worst-smelling barrel and passed it around like a test. This was when the fermented fish returned, split, slimy, eyeless, pale, and sour. It was tradition, an offering to the ancestors, and a punishment for the living all at once. Everyone had to take a bite, even the chieftain, even the youngest child. No one escaped the ritual, because it reminded them, this is what we saved. This is what we became strong enough to eat. And deep inside, each person had a memory of the first time they tasted it. Some remembered vomiting behind the woodpile. Others remembered laughing, mouths full of tears and salt, daring each other to swallow faster. But everyone remembered. No one ever forgot the smell. There were foods that hissed when uncovered, others that bubbled faintly, still fermenting in the dark. Mushrooms that had to be boiled 3 times. Bark turned into flour. Bones roasted until the marrow sang. Every morsel was earned, not by coin, but by knowledge and risk. Those who failed to learn what to eat disappeared by spring. And it wasn't just the food that changed, it was the relationship to food. Hunger rewrote everything. Taste became a luxury. Texture became irrelevant. Food was no longer something to desire. It was something to respect, to fear, to need. No one in the Longhouse asked what was in the stew. They only asked, is there enough? Every pot was a mystery, a soup of meat, roots, salt, and guesswork. Leftovers from 3 days ago stirred into today's broth, ashes from the hearth thickening the bottom like spice. And always the same conclusion: eat or don't wake up tomorrow. And still, there were rules. No waste, not a crumb, not a drop. Children learned to lick their bowls clean, not because they were taught manners, but because they were taught consequence. In the evenings, the barrels were sealed again, the smell trapped once more beneath lids crusted with ice and cloth, but it lingered in their mouths. It followed them into sleep. It became part of them. And in the end, that was the truth of winter. You became what you ate. You learned to live with the rot, or the rot took you. After the last scrap of fermented fish was swallowed, after the pots had been scraped clean of their strange, sour warmth, The Longhouse settled once more into its strange rhythm of breath and necessity. But warmth, true warmth, didn't only come from fire or food or the soft steam of boiled bones. It came with hooves. Inside that single room, where people dreamed and wept and whispered, there were also animals. Not outside. Never outside. Outside was death. The cow stood near the far wall, her massive frame shifting quietly in the straw. Her breath misted in the cold, a soft plume rising like a ghost every few seconds. She didn't belong in the open wind, not now, not in this season where the earth froze harder than stone. She belonged here, inside, near the hearth, where her body heat was worth more than milk. She had a name, of course. Every family named their cow, not as property, but as kin. Some were called soft names like Bruna or Halda or Liskia. Others had names that came from jokes or childhood mispronunciations. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the name was spoken aloud, like a blessing, like a reminder. This animal keeps us alive. Goats nestled nearby, fussing and stamping when stepped on in the dark. Their sharp, amused eyes glimmered even in the dim. Chickens fluttered up into the rafters when night fell, their warmth rising with them, a kind of ceiling insulation made of feathers and shivering dreams. They clucked in their sleep sometimes, stirred by nothing like grandmothers muttering under their breath. The Longhouse was never quiet, not really. It moaned and creaked and whispered, and in winter, it smelled not only of people, but of fur and dung and the wet, sour scent of animals who slept close, who lived close, who were close. It wasn't unpleasant, not entirely. It was alive. Children grew up in this blend of species. To them, it wasn't odd to wake up with a hoof brushing their leg or to fall asleep against the side of a goat that refused to move. They played games between the legs of sheep, balanced rocks on pigs' backs, whispered secrets to chickens as if they understood. One girl drew a line of tiny flowers down the back of her family's goat, using ash from the hearth and the tip of a charred stick. The goat didn't mind, but her mother did. The girl was scolded, not because the goat was harmed, but because the ashes left streaks on the animal's white fur, and vanity, even in art, was not something they could afford. Cleanliness was relative. Everything was layered in the same dirt, the same breath, but there was still order. The animals had their corner, their straw, their routines. They were fed before bedtime, watered after dawn. Children helped with the chores, not as punishment, but as participation. Caring for the animals meant surviving the winter. At night, the sound of chewing was constant, slow, rhythmic, almost meditative. The cows chewed as if praying. The goats snorted and shifted. Chickens sometimes fluttered down in the dark, landing on someone's sleeping chest before returning to their beams. No one panicked. No one screamed. This was the world they knew. And the warmth was undeniable. You could feel it. The way the air closest to the cow's side was thick and forgiving. The way you could sit beside her after coming in from the cold, and your fingers would begin to ache with returning blood. It wasn't just heat, it was mercy. Old people swore they could tell the health of a household by the way their animals moved in the night. A restless cow meant bad luck. A silent chicken meant death. They read the room like a book, and the animals were the punctuation marks, soft clucks, shuffling hooves, sighs of beasts too big to understand what cold really was. Sometimes, a calf would be born in the middle of the coldest week of the year. There would be no question. It stayed inside, wrapped in linen, nursed by hand if needed, held by the youngest, who felt proud even while they dozed, calf breath warming their arms. And once in a while, an animal would die, quietly, or not. And the grief was not spoken, but it was shared. not because of what was lost to the pantry, but because of what was lost to the body heat, to the soundscape of the house, to the strange comfort of being watched in the night by something with dark eyes and no words. The Longhouse was many things: bedchamber, kitchen, nursery, tomb. It was also a barn, but no one said that as if it were a shameful thing. Because here, barn meant life. Animal meant survival. Fur and foot and breath meant the difference between seeing spring or not. They didn't domesticate animals. They lived with them, as equals in the dark. The Longhouse didn't have a chimney, not because they hadn't thought of it, but because smoke, for all its curses, was also a barrier against the biting cold, against insects in summer, and perhaps, in some wordless way, against fear. So the smoke stayed. It gathered in the rafters. It clung to wool. It crept into lungs like a second kind of breath. The fire burned constantly. It had to. And every moment it did, it fed the air with slow, blue ribbons of smoke that curled and pooled and settled into the thatch like an old secret. There was no place to hide from it. Not under the blankets. Not in the corners. It was in the air itself. It was the air. Children learned early. You didn't breathe through your whole nose, not unless you wanted to choke. They were taught half-nose breathing, a strange art passed down from generations of people who had wheezed their way through life but somehow endured. They would press one nostril gently, narrow their mouths, inhale slowly, shallowly. It was as much rhythm as survival. A cough meant failure, and too many failures in a night meant no sleep. Older men and women bore the weight of years of smoke in their ribs. They coughed in the mornings, deep and rattling, like bears waking from hibernation. But they walked, they worked, they were still alive. Their lungs, though scorched, were vessels of defiance. The children watched them closely. When an elder coughed but kept sewing or stacking wood or twisting wool without pause, that was strength, not silence, not stillness, but the ability to keep going with the pain. The air inside the Longhouse was thick enough to touch. It blurred the outlines of faces, turned people into shapes lit from below by fire. Eyes glinted through haze. Voices sounded softer, like they were coming from another world. But no one complained. Complaining was for those who had other houses to go to. Sometimes the smoke shifted with the wind and rushed down instead of up. Those were the worst nights. The Longhouse would fill like a drowning ship, everyone blinking through tears, wiping their eyes with sleeves that already stank of wood and ash. Someone would open a flap or lift a board, just for a moment, to let the poison out. But only briefly. Heat was always more precious than clean air. Mothers held infants under layers of cloth, trying to shield their tiny lungs. Fathers worked near the fire with their faces turned sideways. Grandparents slept sitting upright to keep from choking in their dreams. Everyone had their methods. No one had solutions. Still, the fire burned. It was the same fire that cooked their food, that dried their boots, that warmed their backs when the wind outside tried to peel the soul from their skin, the same fire that cast the shadows of goats and children onto the back wall like a flickering play. And the smoke? It wasn't just a nuisance. It preserved. It lingered in meat, in skin, in wool. It kept away rot and pests. It darkened beams until they shone like old stone. It whispered stories up into the rafters where no one could hear them, but where they somehow stayed. In a way, the Longhouse itself had lungs, and every day it breathed smoke like the people inside it, and every day it survived. No one romanticized it. No one said the smoke was beautiful, but they accepted it. As you accept the cold, as you accept hunger, as you accept the slow turning of time. There were moments, rare and strange, When someone would walk outside after days indoors and take a full breath of clean, frozen air and feel dizzy, not just from the shock of purity, but from the realization of what they had been living in. And yet, they went back inside. Always. Because inside the smoke was the fire, and inside the fire was the heartbeat of the home. And inside the home, people learned not just how to breathe, but how to endure. Clothing in the Viking winter was not a statement, it was a shield. It was armor forged not in fire, but in looms, in calloused hands, in silent, urgent understanding. To live was to layer. To survive was to insulate. There were no fashion debates when the wind howled like a wolf that had learned to speak. No one cared for elegance when the snow came sideways and sliced your breath in half. The question was always the same. Do you have enough on? The layers began with wool, coarse, thick, often itchy, but trusted like an old friend. Underlayers clung close to skin, trapping what little warmth the body could generate. Over that, a second layer, woven tighter, patched in places with whatever material was left from the summer months. And then came the outer garments, heavier, looser, sometimes lined with fur, sometimes just double-thick wool that had darkened from years of fire smoke and frozen sleet. Children, especially, wore more layers than they could move in. Mothers wrapped them like offerings to the gods, 4, sometimes 5 layers, until small arms stuck out stiff and unmoving, and legs waddled with effort. Their voices squeaked from inside their wrappings, muffled and indignant. But no child ever froze under a mother's hand. That was the logic. They looked like walking bundles of hay, these children, or round, rolling turnips. The older ones teased the younger, poking their thick bellies and watching them tip sideways, too padded to right themselves without help. Laughter, warm and quick, burst from red noses and wool-lined hoods. Every layer had meaning. There were no spare clothes. Everything had purpose, a story, a stain, a patch. The brown tunic with the stitched hem? That was once Uncle Sigmar's, before the bear took his leg, and the cold took the rest. The blue wrap with the faded dye? It had seen 10 winters and outlived 2 owners. Even holes were not shameful. They were just another chance to sew, to remember. Buttons were rare. Ties were common. Leather cords, bone toggles, bits of horn or wood. They kept things together when fingers grew too stiff to knot anything finer. A good knot could mean the difference between frostbite and another day alive. Going outside was a ritual. One did not step out into a Viking winter. One prepared. Scarves were wound not once but twice, tucked into collars. Mittens, often made of felted wool or animal skin, were strung through sleeves to avoid losing them. Boots were stuffed with hay or rags. A cloak was thrown over all, fastened with a brooch or a simple wooden peg. And still, the cold found its way in. It always did. Through seams, through breath, through memory. Sometimes someone forgot a layer, or chose speed over safety. They ran out to the woodpile with sleeves rolled too high or a neck uncovered. The result was almost always the same: a cough that lingered, a finger that turned pale, a silence at supper. They learned quickly, these people. The cost of carelessness was immediate. At night, they shed their layers like bark, peeling them off one by one and hanging them near the fire to dry. The garments steamed softly, releasing the day's sweat, the smoke, the traces of effort. Each shirt and sock and wrap hung like a ghost of the body that had worn it. Some slept in their clothes. Others kept one layer on, just in case they had to rise quickly if the fire died, if someone cried out, if the roof cracked under snow. No one felt truly naked, not in the way Southerners thought of it. To be without wool was to be vulnerable, not to shame but to death. Nakedness was not about skin, it was about cold. And so, they wore their survival. On their backs, on their hands, wrapped around their feet, pulled tight across their heads. Clothing wasn't fabric, it was strategy. It was language. It was memory stitched into warmth. And in that silence, when the wind grew tired of screaming, they sat near the fire, layered, bundled, still, and you could hear the soft creak of wool as someone shifted in their seat. Alive, still here, wrapped in the work of many hands. There were few moments in the long gray months of winter when the Vikings embraced the cold by choice. Most of the time, it was something to be guarded against, layered against, fought in silence. But there was one ritual, half cleansing, half reckoning, where cold was not the enemy but the final test. They called it many names, but to them it was simply the steam house. Tucked beside the Longhouse, or sometimes deeper in the forest, to trap the silence better, stood a squat wooden hut. Its roof sagged under snow, its walls were thick with soot and sweat. Inside, stones, some the size of a man's head, were heated for hours over fire until they glowed red, until they pulsed like embers dreaming of something more. Water was ladled onto them slowly, reverently, and the hut would fill with steam, thick, hot, alive, the kind that wrapped around the skin like a second birth. Inside, they stripped off the layers, not just of wool and cloth, but of silence, of restraint. They sat bare and sweating, shoulder to shoulder, eyes closed or open. It didn't matter. Men, women, children, elders. All were equals inside the heat. The steam did more than cleanse the body. It pulled memories from the skin. It opened lungs long punished by smoke. It softened the calluses that grew not just on hands, but on thoughts. And in that dense, shifting fog, people spoke, in low voices, or not at all. Some sang, old cracked songs from before the sea swallowed the last homeland. Others whispered prayers. Some simply breathed, and that was enough. Then came the snow. At a signal, usually from the eldest present, the door would fly open, and the winter would come roaring in. Naked bodies launched from the heat into the snow, into a white so pure it bit like knives. Screams followed, always. Some were shrieks of laughter, others were just involuntary, raw sound torn from raw nerve. They threw themselves into the drifts, rolled, wriggled, wrestled the freeze, muscles seized, chests gasped, steam lifted from skin like souls set free. It was madness, it was joy, and it was tradition. The children called it becoming stone, because that's what it felt like when the cold locked your limbs. The old called it returning to balance. They said you couldn't understand heat unless you met its opposite face to face. There was a game, a ritual within the ritual. After the snow roll, each person would stand barefoot in the drift. The last one to scream was the winner. Every year someone tried to be brave. Every year, someone shouted loud enough to shake a crow from a branch. And everyone would laugh, not at the weakness, but at the power of nature that could break even the toughest bones into howls. Back inside, wrapped again in wool, skin pink from the contrast, there was no need to speak. The ritual had done its work. Water was poured again. Steam rose again. And slowly, the body remembered how to be warm. They did this not just for cleanliness, though that mattered. It fought off disease. It healed cracked skin. But more than that, it taught the soul how to survive extremes. To know that pain was part of life. That screaming didn't mean failure. It meant transformation. Somewhere in the haze of the steam house you could see the truth of winter. It was not to be avoided but endured through fire, through ice, through ritual, through community. The smell inside the hut was always the same. pine sap, wet ash, the faint salt of sweat. It clung to your hair, your nails, your dreams. Days after, you could still smell it and feel a strange calm, like the ghost of warmth had followed you into the cold. It was said that those who skipped the ritual grew brittle, like branches that snapped without warning. And those who embraced it, they came out stronger, louder, more alive. The snow waited every week. It did not grow softer. It did not show mercy. But neither did they. Steam and ice, breath and silence. This was how they washed away the dark, not with soap, but with courage. The nights were the hardest, not because of the cold, though the cold did its best to find every seam and shadow, but because of the silence, the kind of silence that crept in after the chores were done, after the last bowl was scraped clean, after the fire had stopped crackling and settled into a low red glow. It was the hour when thought grew loud and loneliness louder. But that was when the stories began. It always started the same way. Someone, usually the eldest, cleared their throat. Not too loud, not too sudden. Just enough to remind the room that they still had breath and memory. The children perked up immediately, eyes wide over woolen blankets, fingers clutching crusts of bread or carved wooden toys. Even the adults leaned in, though they pretended not to. Everyone needed the stories. Everyone. The voice would rise like smoke, slow, winding, full of pauses where the wind outside whistled like a ghost caught in the thatch. Once upon a time, they told tales of gods with one eye and endless wisdom, of wolves that swallowed the sun and fish that shimmered like flame beneath the ice, of men so brave they laughed in the face of swords, of women so clever they tricked fate itself. But it wasn't the heroism that held the listeners. It was the warmth in the voice, the rhythm of a story wrapping itself around their bones like a second fire. And there were always new versions. No two nights ever told the same tale exactly the same. Some nights, Thor's hammer was stolen by a frost giant and retrieved with a clever disguise. Other nights, the hammer had been lost in a drinking contest. One old man insisted it had turned into a goat once, and no one argued, because arguing would break the spell. The children laughed, not just at the stories, but at the way the elders told them, with winks, with sudden bursts of nonsense, with exaggerated gestures that made small hands slap wool-covered knees. A story could end in battle or in a belch. It didn't matter, so long as it chased the dark away. Sometimes the stories weren't myth at all. They were memories, quiet ones, woven into the rhythm of legend so gently that no one noticed when truth took the place of fiction. A mother spoke of her first hunt, and somehow a giant appeared in the forest. A grandfather remembered sailing through a storm, and suddenly sea serpents were involved. Reality was flexible by the fire. It bent to suit the heart. There were sagas too long for a single night, stories told in parts, stretched over weeks like threads in a tapestry. If someone missed a night, they'd beg for a retelling the next evening. Not because they needed to know what happened, but because they needed to feel that moment again. The moment when a name was spoken with reverence, when a hero stumbled and stood up anyway. Even the animals listened. The cow in the corner, half asleep but oddly still. The goat chewing hay in rhythm to the storyteller's voice. Dogs with their heads on their paws, twitching at the mention of bears or thieves. In that fire-lit space, where smoke curled upward like question marks, the people became more than survivors. They became part of a lineage older than words. They remembered who they were, not just Vikings, not just farmers or fighters, but dreamers, weavers of tales, keepers of breath and wonder. The fire was no longer just heat. It was a stage, a sanctuary, a promise that as long as someone could speak, they were not lost. And when a story ended, there was always a pause, the kind of silence that tasted warm instead of empty. Someone would sigh, a child would giggle, an elder might cough, muttering, "That's not how I heard it," and everyone would groan with mock annoyance. But no one really complained, because the story had done its job. It had pushed the dark back, just a little, had filled the cracks in the night with color and breath, and tomorrow there would be more. New stories, old ones remembered, some made up on the spot, others passed down so many times they'd become smooth as river stones. So the fire kept burning, not just with wood, but with words. And in that flickering light, hearts stayed warm. There came a point in the heart of winter when even the strongest spirits began to bend, when the snow piled against the Longhouse walls high enough to block the view of anything beyond the narrow smoke hole, when the sky remained gray for days, then weeks, and the days themselves were but pale shadows of night. It was then that the people lit the Yule fire, not just to keep warm, but to remember what warmth meant. Yule was not simply a celebration. It was an act of defiance, against the cold, against the hunger, against the silence that crept like frost into the bones. It was the memory of summer whispered through flame. And so, when the time came, they gathered what was left of the good wood, birch, ash, pine, anything that burned steady and brave, and they chose the largest log, the Yule log. It wasn't just chosen for its size, but for its story. Some said it came from a tree that had survived lightning. Others believed it was cut from a sacred grove where spirits rested. Whatever its origin, the log was carried in with solemn strength and laid upon the fire pit with care. The first spark to touch it came from embers carried all the way from last year's Yule, because flame, like memory, must be passed on. Once lit, the Yule log was never allowed to die. It was a rule as old as the village. If the fire went out before Yule ended, it was said misfortune would follow. The cows would go barren, the roof would leak, or worse, someone would not survive the next snow. And so, the fire was watched, day and night. Children took shifts with sleepy eyes and blankets around their shoulders, poking the log when the flame grew shy. Elders whispered to it like a friend who needed encouragement, and as the log burned, so did the mood shift. From the shadows of long nights came laughter. Mead, dark and sweet, was passed from hand to hand in carved horns, its honeyed burn lighting cheeks with more than just alcohol. Songs were sung, some ancient, some made up on the spot, with words that made no sense but made everyone laugh. Drums returned from where they'd been hidden under wool and dust. The beat echoed through the Longhouse floor, reminding the earth that hearts were still beating above it. Food, once rationed with tight hands, was shared more freely. Not because there was more, there wasn't, but because Yule demanded generosity. It was the one week when hoarding was seen as shameful and giving as sacred. A woman would bring out her last slab of cheese. A man might offer the dried berries he'd saved since autumn. Children gave carved trinkets or funny songs. Even the animals were treated to extra straw or scraps, honored as part of the home's warmth. The Longhouse transformed. Pine branches were brought in, tied with threads dyed red and gold. Bones were cleaned and carved into shapes, runes, animals, sun symbols, and hung from the rafters. A deer skull, polished and smiling, was set above the fire, not as a warning, but as a memory of life taken with thanks. At the heart of it all was the fire. It danced differently during Yule, taller, bolder, as if it too knew it had a role beyond heat. People told stories not of survival, but of light. Tales of the sun being stolen and bargained back, of wolves chased away by laughter, of ancestors who walked through snowstorms with only a spark in their hand and came home with spring in their footsteps. There were rituals, too. Each family carved a wish rune and placed it near the fire, not for gods necessarily, but for the spirit of warmth itself. The wishes were simple. Let my daughter grow strong. Let the cow give milk again. Let me see green things once more. On the final night of Yule, before the log burned down to ash, someone would stay awake until dawn. This person, often chosen by quiet consensus, was called the Fire Watcher. They would whisper to the flames every name of the family, one by one, as if stitching them into the heat itself. Then, just as the first hint of light returned to the horizon, they would stand and say softly but clearly, "It is not gone. The sun remembers us." And with that, Yule would end, not with a bang, but with a breath. The log would be left to crumble, and a small piece of its heart would be saved, wrapped in cloth and kept for the next year. The ashes were mixed into the soil near the door, blessing it against misfortune. Afterward, the Longhouse returned to its rhythms. The silence crept back, but it no longer felt empty. It was a silence that held songs, laughter, smoke, the promise of return. And so they went on. Not because the winter had ended, but because the fire had reminded them it would. By the time the last embers of Yule had been swept into the cold earth and the pine branches withered above the doorframe, winter had reclaimed its throne with a quiet cruelty. The songs faded back into memory. The mead jars were emptied, and the rhythm of survival returned with sharpened edges. But while the adults bore the weight of daily endurance, it was the children who faced a different kind of education, one without books, without chalk, without the soft voice of a teacher at the front of a warm room. In the Longhouse, the lessons were written in calloused hands and aching joints, in the flick of a knife over bone, and the hush of breath before the fire. A child's classroom was a bench by the hearth, a spot on the dirt floor beside their grandmother's knees, a corner of the house where the light just barely touched the wool. And their first textbooks were threads, smoke, wood chips, and the cold that bit through every mistake. They learned not what to think, but how to last. The first lesson came early: thread the bone needle. It was harder than it looked. The eye was small and the hands clumsy from the cold, but it had to be done. Without stitches, there were no cloves, no repairs, no sacks to hold dried berries or bones or salt. A child might sit for hours trying, tongue between their teeth, eyes watering from the smoke, until the thread slid through at last, and no one clapped because success was expected. Once a child could thread, they were given their first piece of leather, not clean or smooth, but tough, uneven, cured by time and touch. They would be taught to shape it into a pouch, a small one, just enough to hold a flint, or a folded note, or a tiny knife if they were lucky. This was no toy. It was a mark, a first possession, a whispered signal that they had begun to join the line of those who knew how to keep themselves and others alive. Sometimes, during the harshest weeks, the lesson was simply to keep going. How to build a fire when the wind stole every spark. How to eat food that smelled wrong but saved your strength. How to stitch a wound, how to pull a splinter with a curved bone hook, how to hold your breath when the stew was only water and dried onions. They didn't learn from instructions. They learned by doing, by watching, by being told, try again. Mistakes weren't punished. They were simply cold, wet, painful. That was teaching enough. And then there were the songs. Not lullabies, but work songs, spindle songs, threshing chants. Quiet melodies hummed through chapped lips while hands spun wool into thread or carved spoons from stubborn pine. Children were given rhythms before they understood meanings. The beat of survival was old. It entered their bones before their words did. The elders watched closely. Not all children learned at the same pace. Some couldn't bear the cold on their fingers. Others cried when they cut themselves with a dull blade. But they were not scolded. Instead, an old woman might reach over, show her crooked hand and say, "This happened to me too." And I kept going. Sometimes a child would ask, "When do we stop learning?" The answer was always the same: when the snow melts through your skin and you don't feel it anymore. And so they learned. They learned that wool wasn't just fabric, it was armor. That food wasn't just for hunger, it was protection. That silence wasn't emptiness, it was space to hear what mattered. They carved their names into pieces of driftwood. They built small traps in the snow and caught mice. They learned which mushrooms burned the tongue and which soothed a belly. They watched their mothers stitch boots from fur. They copied the way their fathers split bone for marrow. And slowly, they transformed. You could see it in the way they walked, shoulders hunched like grown men, eyes sharp like old women, lips that rarely smiled but rarely complained. By the time they reached 10 winters, they were no longer just children. They were small versions of something older than themselves, carriers of knowledge that no scroll could hold. But there were softer moments too. A girl gifting her first sewn pouch to her younger brother. A boy helping an elder untangle thread without being asked. 2 children huddling under the same wolfskin while practicing their knife grips. Each gesture was part of the learning. Because survival wasn't just about skill, it was about memory, about care, about sharing what you knew before it vanished into the snow. And when one child finally finished their first pouch, leather stretched, stitches crude but holding, they were told, quietly, "This is your beginning." It wasn't celebrated loudly. No applause, no feast, just a nod, a faint smile, and the knowledge that they had joined the circle, not yet ready to carry others, but strong enough now to carry themselves. That was how the Longhouse endured, not by waiting for spring, but by teaching the cold to every child, not as an enemy, but as a patient, merciless teacher. Winter, for all its quiet moments, always took something. Sometimes it was a lamb born too early, sometimes a cough that never left a child's chest, and sometimes it was the old man who had taught 3 generations how to read cloud patterns, or the mother who always knew when the broth needed more marrow. The snow never apologized. It fell evenly on rooftops and graves alike, and the Longhouse, filled with wool and breath and memory, would tremble slightly in the silence after loss. But no one screamed. No one threw themselves upon the floor. That was not their way. Their grief was worn like another layer of wool, thick, quiet, stitched tightly to the skin. The body was never buried in frozen ground. Instead, they wrapped the lost one in the best furs still whole, laid them near the fire one final night. The embers were not allowed to die. The room remained lit until dawn. There were no priests, no carved stones, only hands. Rough hands that had known rope and axe, now braiding hair for the last time, smoothing blankets over closed eyes, whispering words meant not for the dead, but for those who remained. Children were not sent away. They were expected to stay, to see, to know. A small boy might ask, "Why does he not wake up?" And his grandmother would answer without trembling, "Because he gave everything he had to this winter, and now he rests." No attempt was made to soften the truth. Death was not a curse, it was the cost. When the sun finally pierced through the thick sky, when the snow dripped steadily from the edge of the roof, the village would prepare for the old rite. From each home that had lost someone, they would bring out the last garment of the departed, often a tunic, a fur-lined shawl, sometimes a single glove if that was all that remained. And they would gather in the clearing, where the fire pit had long been kept beneath stone. One by one, each piece was cast into the flame. They watched it burn. They did not cry loudly. They watched until the cloth crumbled into ash, and the smoke rose upward, dancing like the spirits they imagined hovering just beyond the wind. It was said that the smoke carried the memory upward, so the gods might know who had lived well, who had kept others warm, who had shared their bread, who had whispered stories when the nights stretched too long. Afterward, the silence returned. But it was a different silence, one that ached in the bones. And yet, life did not stop. The next day, traps had to be checked. Children had to be dressed. Wood had to be split. The fire, always the fire, needed tending. Someone might be missing from their usual place by the hearth, the empty spot too wide, too quiet. But the others would adjust, slowly, shuffling a bit closer, taking on the tasks once done by the one now gone. They did not speak of moving on. There was no such thing. They carried each name, each story in their hands as they worked, in their mouths as they hummed over the pots, in their backs as they bent low beneath the weight of kindling. And when it snowed again, as it always did, they would look up, eyes squinting, breath steaming, and someone might murmur, "He would have laughed at this snow." And someone else would reply, "She would have known when it would stop." In that way, the dead were not gone. They had merely stepped behind the veil of ice, where memory and survival became one. Loss was certain, but so was endurance. That was the pact. That was winter's law. Give something, lose something, and then rise again, under heavier wool, carrying one more name inside your ribs. At first, no one dared to believe it. The air had changed, slightly, not warmer, no, but different. The cold still held them, but it no longer bit. It brushed. And in the hush of early morning, someone noticed. A drip. Then another. Then a slow, uneven trickle from the edge of the thatch roof, like the house itself had begun to cry. The first thaw never came with trumpet or song. It came in whispers. It came in smells. The scent of damp soil hidden since the end of autumn rose like a ghost beneath the snow. Moss, wet bark, the musk of long dead leaves pressed into mud. It seeped through the cracks of the Longhouse, waking memories that had been buried under months of frost and fatigue. Ears strained for what was no longer silence. Then, suddenly, birdsong. Just one note at first, then two. A high, thin call from a branch not yet green, not yet budding, but daring to hold a voice again. Inside, no one spoke. They simply paused. One woman stirred the pot slower. A boy at the door stopped tying his boots. An old man tilted his head and whispered, "The thrush is back." And with that, the world began to breathe again. They didn't rush outside. That wasn't the way of things. They watched. They waited. They learned to trust the melt. It was a dangerous time still. The earth, softening too quickly, could collapse. Streams once frozen now gurgled with unpredictable hunger, and the sky, though lighter, remained a moody companion, bright one hour, sullen the next. But beneath it all, the land was loosening its grip, and the people, they began to follow. Children were the first to move. Always. They ran toward puddles as if drawn by ancient instinct. Their feet, wrapped in cracked leather and hope, splashed through the sludge with wild laughter. Some still clutched the brittle remains of dry biscuits, hoarded since the dark days of January, now soggy in their fists but too precious to drop. Mothers shouted, half laughing, half exhausted, as the little ones returned covered in streaks of blackened snow, their cheeks flushed, their eyes shining in a way not seen since the last harvest moon. Even the animals shifted. The goats grew restless. The chickens, who had huddled for warmth in silence, began to cluck and scratch. The old cow near the hearth let out a long, groaning low, not of complaint, but of relief. And the fire, that had once roared in defiance of winter, now burned softer, less out of need, more out of habit, as if it too knew that its long watch was nearing its end. The elders sat just outside the Longhouse door, for the first time in months. Wrapped in wool, their bones still stiff, but their faces turned toward the pale, watery sunlight with something like reverence. They didn't smile, not yet, but their eyes lingered on the patches of brown earth that began to emerge. They nodded occasionally, muttered short phrases. It held together well, this time. No wolves this year. She made it through. He didn't. A breath. He's part of the soil now. And no one cried. Because it wasn't sadness. It was the price, once again, paid. The first thaw was never loud. It was not a celebration. It was recognition. A marking. They had survived. And though the hardest weeks might still lie ahead, the floods, the sickness, the rebuilding, none of that mattered in this moment. The world had tilted back toward light, and every sound, every smell, every muddy boot print left by a laughing child was proof. No horn blew, no god spoke, but they knew, deep in the marrow of their tired, frost-bitten bones, that the worst had passed. They stood in the doorways, staring out at a land waking slowly. A land that did not promise kindness, but had at least, for now, offered mercy. They didn't write it down. No one etched it in stone. There were no banners to carry, no scrolls to preserve. But every Viking knew the truth, not from books, but from breath, from blood, from the way a hand reached for another in the dark and stayed there until the morning. Survival, they had learned, was never a solitary act. One person couldn't hold off a winter. One pair of arms couldn't chop enough wood. One heart alone couldn't keep the fire lit when the cold clawed at the edges of everything. It had taken all of them. The crying babies and the quiet elders, the men who stitched boots while their fingers bled, the women who gave up meals so the children could eat, the dogs that curled at their feet, the goats that huddled beside their beds, the cow that gave milk even when thin as bone. No one made it through the cold alone, and they never pretended otherwise. It was in the way they lay down at night, pressed close like spoons in a bowl. It was in the way they passed food without asking, patched cloaks with leftover thread, traded stories like they were bread. It was in the calloused hands reaching to pull someone out of the snowdrift, in the shared silence after loss, in the songs hummed not to cheer themselves, but to keep the dying calm. The old woman, the one with the cough that never quite left, whose fingers could still spin wool blindfolded. She had lived through more winters than most could count. Her back was bent, her voice thin, but her memory strong. And when the thaw came, she sat by the doorway, wrapped in the same shawl her own mother had spun, watching the children run barefoot in the mud. She did not smile often, but that morning she did. A boy, her great-grandson, ran to her, slipping on the melting frost, face beaming, cheeks red. He handed her something, a tiny flower, crushed slightly, its petals bruised but real, living, a sign that the world still turned. She took it in her shaking hands and held it to her chest. And as the wind brushed past, carrying the smell of moss and wood smoke and coming spring, she leaned closer to the child and whispered what she had long carried in her bones. It wasn't the fire that kept me warm. It was you. The boy didn't understand, not yet. But one day, when his hands were old and his hair turned to ash, he would remember. And he would say the same to someone small and bright-eyed, carrying a crushed flower in muddy hands. Because this was the true inheritance, not the tools, not the tales, not even the strength. It was the closeness, the knowing, the unspoken vow that I will not leave you to face this cold alone. That vow burned hotter than any hearth. It lit the dark. It thawed the silence. It made life where death had lingered. And though the Longhouse might one day fall, and the names of its dwellers be lost to wind and sea, that warmth, that fierce, quiet love would remain, passed down not in words, but in the way two people lean toward each other when the world grows cold, in the way a hand reaches out and another hand takes it. No trumpet, no monument, just survival, together. Because the fire fades, the meat runs out, the snow returns. But what endures, what always endures, is this: we lived. Because we were never alone. So now, as the last embers dim and the wind softens its voice, we step away from the Longhouse, from the warmth of bodies pressed close, from the crackle of fire and the soft hum of stories told to survive the silence. What you've just heard wasn't just about Vikings. It was about resilience born in darkness, about how human beings, stripped of comfort, still found ways to laugh, to hold one another, and to keep walking, even when winter had no end in sight. Every woolen thread spun, every breath through smoke, every mouthful of sour fish, they were acts of courage, not grand, not loud, but real. And maybe, just maybe, in our own winters, whatever shape they take, we carry a piece of that same spirit, that same fire. Thank you for staying here, in this quiet space between story and memory. Your presence truly made this journey complete. If this story touched something in you, a thought, a memory, a warmth, I hope you'll come back. Because there are many more stories to tell, and like the Vikings knew so well, they're better shared. Until then, stay close to the fire and to each other. We'll meet again, soon,